right, so we took a quick look at those subjects, the workstations, the sequencers, and sound modules and things like that in the last video. And we want to take a little bit closer look at that. But basically, to understand that, is that if you look around, that you will find, workstations, sequencers, and sound modules and things like that. And to go on and on about what all the different ones will do, would be ridiculous, I mean, it really would. You really need to understand, you will understand what you need as your level progresses, about the best way to say that. You want to get a fairly decent workstation to work with. Sequencers and things like that you kind of want to look into, but it's really going to depend on how far you take the production for what you're trying to do. So really trying to address that from a real general aspect is about the best way to go. Let's take a look. Let's just go over and reevaluate or relook at, things like this. Midi messages. What can be sent? So you've got the basics that can be sent that we've talked about. So your workstation is going to be working with that information as far as the Midi messages. What it can send other than sound. I mean, the Midi information there isn't any sound there anyway. All it can send is information. So, if you're talking about the workstation and the sequencers, or, the sequencer is basically going to be working with sound, almost like an internal, synthesis, or, it's going to be working, with the Midi file and an internal sound module or something external. Same thing with the workstation. So you really need to look at what your workstation, what all you needed to do. And we've already talked about, the basics of what that workstation and the parameters on it are going to be able to control. I mean, anything from foot switches to, aftertouch, patch change, channel pressure, pitch bend. I mean, we've already talked about those. So it's going to be directly related to what your workstation is going to be able to do. And it might do a whole lot of other things as far as working with your DAW. So whatever other piece of recording equipment that you're working with. So you really need to look at that, at what all you want it to do. But we're just addressing Midi information right now. What all that can do can be very complex. So, you've got the basic Midi messages, so it's going to want to address those to some point. The Midi formats, the information that it can send. We looked at the format in the meta event of, what kind of information that it can send. So you're going to want to address those issues when you're talking about some kind of workstation of what all information it can send. There might be all kinds of other stuff on there that, that your workstation might be incorporated with some type of, synthesizer or something else, or, some kind of I mean, it might do all kinds of things but it basically going to have to directly relate to that if we're talking about Midi information and what it's going to transmit. And then the last thing you got to look at is system exclusive things, or things that are specific to the manufacturer. Because at that point that your workstation may only interact with certain things because it's basically its protocol and its format that it's working with that protocol is going to only, it might send, some very unique messages and some unique information, but it's only going to send that. It's only worth anything if it's sending it to something that can receive it. It's just like I know all this information in Chinese and I can say all this cool stuff in Chinese or send this information in Chinese, but if the other piece of equipment can't understand Mandarin, then it is worthless. Does that make sense? So that's the key point to get in your head when you're talking about a workstation or something like that. And to think about it from that point of view of the formatting, the protocol, and then communicating and the different things that they might be able to communicate. The Midi information is what we're talking about. And so that your workstation, as far as dealing with the Midi, is going to have to address those issues specifically. And we've already talked about them. So that very basic understanding, and then relate that to the workstation, of what it can send. Does that make sense? And or system exclusive things that might be very particular to a specific, workstation, using a specific protocol, or protocol or format. And the other thing is, when you're looking at the workstations, that, with that in mind, as far as the Midi, that you can really keep yourself getting caught up in some, ridiculous workstation that does all this really wild stuff. that really doesn't have anything to do with what you want it to do, or it might. It's incorporated into a synthesizer or some kind of sampler, or God knows what all it could do. I mean, it could have a sequencer, and it could, if you got the money, it can do, just about anything, your dang DAW can do, and you can get it set up on your dang workstation. So that's the thing you want to address, because the workstations can be very varied. And most time when you're just talking about a workstation, you're talking about some type of keyboard that's set up to, do certain things to transfer information that it's working with your DAW. So the basics is what you need to focus on, and how those are going to go together. What it can do in the format and in the protocol, what it can send, and what of those things you want to buy. And if you're looking at system specific things that might do some real specific cool things, then you need to dig around in that and say, well, it would be, and just research that a little bit. You might come up, spend some money and come up with, a workstation that does some really cool things, as long as you can make it communicate with your other software or hardware. So that's a real simple way to look at it. And to keep it real simple in your mind that way, that's why we started out with protocols and format. So that can be directly related to your workstation as far as the MIDI is concerned, and channels, and how it's being routed and what all that can do with that. And the next thing would be sequencers. Now, we talked a little bit about sequencers, and the basic concept of that is very simple. And if you keep that basic simple concept that and that can branch out to where your sequencers can get very complex, with all kinds of them doing all kinds of different things, sound modules incorporated into them, and all kinds of different things like that. But basically the sequencers can be like drum sequencers, piano sequencers, synth sequencers, but most of the time the sequencer either has to send a message to trigger something, or it has to have some type of sound module, or some kind of synth or sampler built into it that has sound to work with. And I think we basically covered that. But I just kind of wanted to go back and address that, because I thought about that, and I thought, well, we could really get in depth into that. But if you just understand the basic concept that it's sequencing MIDI information in time, and the other thing that might trigger other sequencers or other sound modules or other things that are going on, and you'll take that to the level that you need to, but the basic understanding of what it's doing with that MIDI information we talked about. And the workstation I kind of wanted to address, because I thought, well, to really go and get into that, it's like, that's the basic concept. And when we're talking about MIDI, that's the things you should be concerned about. You look at the protocols, you look at the format that it's working with, that it's going to be working with or can work with, and then you're going to base, what type of a workstation you're going to be working with. That's, a workstation to work with your DAW. So, those are the pertinent things to look at. Which I do believe we covered, we covered, generally, and that you're looking into it a little bit more specifically after you look at some workstations. And there's a lot of them out there, and I'm not going to recommend none of them, because depending on what you do, you might get a real simple workstation that doesn't do hardly much, or you might really be into it and do a lot of work from your workstation as far as the MIDI is concerned, before it ever reaches the DAW. And so you're going to be very concerned about that. At what level of MIDI information do you want coming out of your workstation to work with, in a progressive thing? And we've already talked about that. Starting at the workstation, it goes into the compositional software, or it goes into the DAW piano roll, or it goes from the compositional software into the DAW, into the MIDI editing, aspects of your DAW and piano roll editors. And then it goes to, it can go into other sequencers, or you can put that information into other sequencers in your DAW. And, or then at that point, at whatever path whatever path that's taken, eventually, hopefully ending up, a sound file that you're further sculpting on. So it really depends on, what level you want that MIDI information to be at as it goes from one to the next, and how much you're working on the MIDI information in any given one of those applications. And that's something you really need to think about, because it's very, obvious that you can get a very simple workstation and then get it in your compositional software, sending it to your DAW and the editor, the MIDI editor in there, the piano roll editor, and maybe another sequencer in your DAW, and then really working with it as far as you can there, and then making a sound file or an audio file, and then working at it from there. So it really depends on, what level of MIDI information you want being sent. And you really need to sit down and think about that. So I hope I covered that a little bit better, so that when you're thinking about a workstation, that as far as the MIDI information is concerned, what you need to look at as far as, how you're going to approach any specific workstation. And as far as the keyboard, and that type of a workstation, other types of workstations we are not getting into for MIDI kind of stuff, because you can get into huge, you're talking about your entire studio is a workstation, right? So we're not going there, right at this moment. So I hope I addressed that fairly generally, so that when you're thinking about it and you're trying to get a control surface that's a workstation to work with the MIDI information or whatnot, that, the first thing, the MIDI information, how you should look at it and how you should approach it for which workstation you need or want for your level of production, or how much work that's going to do before it goes into these other applications. And the other aspect you need to look at is what all you want that workstation to be able to do. Is it just a workstation for MIDI? Is it a synthesizer? Is it, is it a sampler? Is it, what all's it got in it? I mean, it can be, it can be, I don't know what all you might want there, how much you're going to work from there, or how much you're going to work in the studio with your synths and samplers in there after you get the raw MIDI information done, or, does that make sense? So I hope I generalized that well enough to where when you're thinking about it, that those are the aspects you really want to look at. The MIDI information, that should be very simple for you to address. The second part is what all do you want that workstation to be able to do? Are you going to really work with that keyboard? Is that just going to be for working with MIDI, or is it going to be, doing all kinds of synth stuff, all kinds of, sampler stuff? And what all do you want that to do, or are you going to do that in the DAW? So you need to address that situation. Myself, I work in the DAW. I work in there because I don't like signal flow, and whenever I need to mess with something or adjust something, I want all in one space. I don't want to mess with it there and then mess with it there unless something really cool is going on. And nowadays, there's not much point, because they got stuff that's so cool nowadays that there's no point in that unless it's going to be for a live application or really does something super cool. So I hope I addressed that in a general way, that you made that easy for you to address that situation or that subject very easily for yourself. The other things we talked about with sequencers and sound modules, that those are very specific things that, you understand what they're doing and you understand how they're connected, and you need to understand whether they're going to be important to you or you can do them in the DAW, depending on what your setup is. And the sequencers the same way, whether it's going to be simple sequencers in your DAW, or it's going to be, very large production things outside of your DAW that you're doing with sequencing, that's directly related to MIDI information. Now, I'm not sure what your workflow might entail for you to make some of those decisions, but my advice is try to keep your workstation, that your keyboard working with MIDI information, as simple as possible, and try to work with most of those things inside of the DAW as much as you can. The less signal flow outside of the DAW, the better. I mean, all types, any of that kind of stuff. And when we're talking about MIDI, that we've addressed the basic things, and as far as I'm concerned, the most important things that would be pertinent to you inside of a production, unless that the production really comes outside of the DAW for certain applications, and then, or you recording other people and things like that, and then you're going to have to take that stuff into consideration as Bob walks in with some some workstation he wants you not record, that he wants to run into your DAW, and you might have to do some work on figuring that out. So you're going to have to work with his equipment, and that can be another huge thing for you to take into consideration. So that should address that fairly generally and fairly specifically, and give you direction about how you should approach that for what you need. Peace, hope, love.